Cop spits on Big Shaq. The crowd gasps, but Shaq doesn't flinch. Then comes the line that flips the world. Police chief is my best friend. And just like that, the badge freezes. The park holds its breath, and power shifts without a punch. Because when Big Shaq stands still, even the system stumbles. Before we deep dive into this story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was just after 7:11 a.m. when Shaquille O'Neal stepped onto the gravel path that wound through Liberty Grove Park, a pocket of green nestled between gentrified apartment blocks and a crumbling courthouse that had seen too many forgotten trials. He wore a simple gray hoodie, hood down, and loose black sweats. No entourage, no flash, just Big Shaq, moving slow, steady, like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to feel. The early sun broke through the last of the morning fog, casting long shadows across the worn benches and still damp picnic tables. The park buzzed gently. Dog walkers murmured greetings to each other. Joggers passed in rhythmic puffs of breath, and a few school buses unloaded noisy clusters of children by the playground near the eastern gate. Birds called overhead, their songs cutting cleanly through the rising city noise. Shaq liked this time of day. It was the only part that still felt real. As he passed the bronze statue of civil rights activist Martha Caldwell, he nodded respectfully. The statue had been there for years, but barely anyone looked at it. Shaq always did. He touched the edge of the plaque like a silent handshake, a ritual. He didn't care if anyone watched. He wasn't here for anyone's approval. Then he saw it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. A woman in a crisp tan coat paused mid-step, her little boy in tow. The kind of kid that looked like he was still getting used to his oversized backpack. She glanced at Shaq, eyes locking for half a second before flinching away. She tightened her grip on the child's hand and pulled him closer, guiding him off the path and into the wet grass. Shaq didn't stop. He didn't say a word. But something in his chest tightened, not in anger, but in that quiet ache he knew too well. The one that came with being a walking contradiction in the eyes of America. Beloved and feared, celebrated and avoided, respected, and still not safe. He kept walking. A pair of teenage girls on a bench whispered as he passed. They weren't subtle. Glances turned into giggles. Phones came up, screens capturing him like an exhibit. Shaq wasn't annoyed. He was used to this too. Being 6'11" with a presence that could swallow a room meant being noticed was never optional. But even now, years out of the NBA, after building schools, housing projects, and donating millions, people still only saw the frame before the face. Near the central fountain, a street vendor was setting up shop, coffee, bagels, and pre-packed fruit cups under a striped umbrella. Shaq approached, greeted the man with a familiar fist bump. They'd known each other for a while. Benny, the vendor, was one of the few people in the park who didn't treat him like a zoo animal or a walking threat. They exchanged brief pleasantries, Benny mentioning his daughter's college applications, Shaq slipping a 20 into the tip jar without a word. A loud squeal of laughter caught his attention. Across the park, a group of kindergartners had begun their class trip. Their teacher, a short woman with a booming voice, wrangled them into two uneven lines as they headed toward the botanical trail. One kid, a tiny girl with frizzy pigtails, waved in Shaq's direction. Shaq smiled and waved back, and for a split second, something warm cut through the tension in his chest. A moment of innocence, realness. But the moment shattered as a low murmur began to ripple through the space behind him. A sound not of children, not of morning peace, but of rising tension. Shaq turned slightly, catching movement from the far gate. A white police cruiser crept into view, tires crunching against gravel. The door opened. A young woman in uniform stepped out, adjusting her belt with the kind of swagger that came not from experience but insecurity. She scanned the park with narrowed eyes, her hand resting on her hip near her holster. Something about her stance told Shaq this wasn't a routine patrol. He didn't move. He sipped his coffee. He watched. She spotted him. Locked eyes. There was a flicker, recognition, then something darker. Her jaw clenched. She muttered into her radio, though Shaq couldn't hear what. Her gaze didn't leave him. He felt the sudden awareness of people watching. A man holding his dog's leash paused mid-step. A jogger slowed slightly, pretending to tie his shoe. Shaq stood still. Not frozen. Just grounded. Calm. The officer walked straight toward him, each step charged with something she hadn't yet earned. Confidence? Fear? Arrogance? All of it sat behind her eyes. And behind her eyes sat something else. An idea of him that had nothing to do with who he really was. Shaq didn't speak. He didn't need to. This wasn't his first time being misunderstood. Not the first time someone in uniform measured his skin before his soul. But what struck him wasn't her approach. It was what was missing. There was no hello. No question. No reason given. Just tension, humming like an electric fence between them. The kind that didn't require a single word to be dangerous. Then, with the kind of silence that rang louder than a shout, she spat. Not at him, but close enough. It hit the gravel near his shoe, a sharp wet slap that cracked the quiet open. Gasps echoed. A mother clutched her child. Someone raised a phone. The whisper of record buttons being hit sliced the air. Shaq didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, he looked her in the eye, his expression unreadable, then glanced toward the badge on her chest. And without raising his voice, without even shifting his weight, he said something that would change everything. But that was still to come. For now, the air stood still, as if even the sun wasn't sure what it had just witnessed. The park, once humming with life, now held its breath. Shaq had just finished his coffee when he noticed an elderly man struggling with a grocery cart at the far end of the walking trail, near the cracked brick archway that led into the neighborhood behind the park. The cart's front wheel wobbled with each step, and the man, dressed in a faded flannel and worn-out sneakers, looked like he hadn't slept much. His plastic bags, filled with canned goods and oranges, leaned precariously over the edge. Without hesitation, Shaq stepped off the main path and walked toward him, instinctively offering his hand without a word. The man looked up, startled for a moment, then recognition softened his face. "You're Shaquille, right?" the man asked, breath shallow but warm with familiarity. Shaq nodded. "Let me help you with that." There was something sacred in the simplicity of the moment. A small gesture, yes, but unspoken kindness always seemed to carry more weight. He took hold of the cart handle and steadied it as they slowly crossed the grass together, moving toward the small bench under a jacaranda tree where the man said he liked to rest before heading home. There was no spectacle here, no performance, just a tall, gentle man helping someone who could barely carry his own weight anymore. But that grace didn't last long. From the main road came a sharp screech, not of brakes but of authority announcing itself too loudly. A police cruiser swerved into the gravel entrance, tires kicking up dust. Without turning, Shaq knew. He'd felt that sound before. Not just the engine, but the energy it carried. Officer Kelly Raines stepped out like a storm in uniform. Blonde hair pulled into a tight braid, boots polished to gleam, and a look on her face like she was still proving something to the force, to herself, to the ghosts that haunted her own assumptions. She moved quickly, radio crackling as she barked something into it. Unintelligible from a distance, but urgent. Her hand hovered near her hip, even though her holster remained closed. She scanned the park like a predator looking for movement. Shaq stood beside the old man, one hand on the cart, the other at his side. He didn't back away, didn't step forward either, just waited. She approached fast, eyes locked on him. The bags, the size of him. No questions, no greetings, just a gaze that had already passed judgment. "We got a call," she said, her voice clipped and hard. "Large male matching your description, loitering, potentially harassing park guests." Shaq didn't reply. He didn't need to. The absurdity hung in the air like smoke. The old man raised a hand to explain, to say something, anything. But Officer Raines cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I'm talking to him," she snapped, her voice laced with tension she hadn't yet earned. The park around them had quieted. Parents near the playground turned their heads. A man jogging slowed, pulling out his phone. Benny, the vendor, paused with a bagel mid-wrap, eyes fixed on the scene. Raines took one more step forward, close enough that Shaq could see the fine white scar on her left cheek, just below the eye. She looked up, way up, and yet her posture screamed superiority. Then, without a word, she spat. It hit the ground inches from Shaq's boot. There was no mistaking the message. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was something colder, deliberate disrespect. She didn't reach for a weapon, didn't shout. She didn't have to. The act alone was violence in a different form. Clean, quiet, and loud in all the wrong ways. Gasps rippled. Children stopped mid-play. Phones were now in full view, red record lights blinking like sirens. Shaq didn't flinch. His eyes didn't narrow, didn't flash with rage. Instead, they remained steady, unreadable, almost calm. The kind of calm that only comes from years of carrying more than his share of weight. The kind that makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't give them what they expect. Rains shifted her stance, suddenly aware of the attention. Her jaw clenched. A flash of something, maybe doubt, passed across her face, but she buried it quick. Shaq looked at her, long enough to make the silence between them unbearable. Then, with the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard, he said the words that pulled the rug from beneath her. "You might want to call your boss. The police chief happens to be my best friend."
It wasn't bravado, it wasn't a threat, it was a fact.
Delivered with the kind of weight that rewrites the tone of a conversation without changing volume. Rains blinked. Her eyes flickered. The certainty drained from her expression like water through cracked cement. She straightened up as if reflexively trying to regain control. But the crowd had already sensed the shift. Shaq turned back toward the old man and helped him to the bench like nothing had happened. Like the spit hadn't just hit the gravel. Like he wasn't being judged in real time by dozens of strangers and a woman with a badge. But the stain was there, not on the uniform, not on the sidewalk. Somewhere deeper, a stain in the silence, in the way everyone watched but didn't move, in the way no one spoke until the danger had passed them by. Officer Rains didn't retreat. She stood still, frozen in place, the reality of what she'd done slowly creeping into her spine. The old man finally spoke, not to her, but to Shaq. "You okay, son?" Shaq nodded once. But nothing about this morning had been okay. The cameras would make sure the world saw it, but the moment wasn't for them. It wasn't for social media or hot takes. It was for every time he'd been followed in a store. Every time someone locked their car when he passed. Every time a kid looked at him with awe, only for their parent to pull them away. A uniform had spit, but it wasn't saliva. It was the system, and it had landed exactly where it was always meant to. Shaq walked away slowly, leaving the stain behind, but carrying everything else with him. Shaq didn't look at her again. His focus remained steady as he guided the elderly man to the bench, placing the grocery cart beside him with a gentleness that felt like defiance in its own right. He didn't check the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the camera. He had made his statement, and now he let the silence carry its own echo. Rain stood rooted in place, her spine rigid but uncertain. Her fingers twitched at her side. Her brain raced, cataloging, calculating, scrambling. She thought she was responding to a routine dispatch, suspicious subject in the park. She thought she was asserting control, but now her sense of control unraveled strand by strand. She didn't ask who his friend was. She didn't need to. There was only one person Shaquille O'Neal would call boss in this context. Only one person in this city who could validate or destroy a badge with a single phone call. Dale Carrington, her chief. A man whose photo sat framed on the wall outside the precinct conference room, whose skin was closer to Shaq's than hers, who had risen through a system that hadn't wanted him but needed him. Rains felt something foreign coil in her chest. Not just fear, but exposure. She had overplayed her hand in front of too many eyes, and now she didn't know what cards were left. Behind her, voices buzzed, not panicked, not riotous, but electric. The kind of noise that doesn't just observe something, it charges it. Phones were still held high, some recording, some live streaming. She caught a sliver of her own face in a front-facing camera and felt the tremble of consequence ripple up her spine. Shaq turned slowly, only slightly, and met her eyes again, not with malice, not even judgment. There was something worse there. Disappointment. Not loud, not angry, just the quiet hollow weight of someone who had hoped for better and knew he shouldn't have. Rains took one slow step back, not realizing she was doing it. Her boots crunched softly on gravel. The sound felt deafening. The elderly man on the bench looked at her now, too. His eyes weren't angry either. They were tired. As if he'd seen this play out so many times. It no longer even surprised him. That somehow made it worse. Her hand dropped from her belt. She reached up, adjusted the strap on her vest with a nervous flick, trying to regain the rhythm of movement. But the power had already shifted. This wasn't just about what she'd done, it was about what she'd revealed. And now, under the weight of Shaq's gaze, under the awareness of the crowd, and the history carved into every inch of this park, her role was no longer law enforcement. She was no longer in control. She was on trial, and the jury was watching. She cleared her throat, trying to summon something rehearsed. "Sir, if you feel you've been..." But Shaq raised a single hand, not abrupt, not commanding, just enough to say, "Stop, don't try to fix it." She obeyed the gesture before she even realized it. And then came the whispers. Not from him, from the crowd. "That's Shaq, man. She spit at Shaquille O'Neal. "You kidding me? She's gonna lose that badge." Rains felt heat crawl up her neck. She had been trained for confrontation. She had rehearsed responses to escalating threats. But this wasn't that. This was a mirror being held up to her. One she hadn't asked for and couldn't look away from. Her training didn't prepare her for a man who stood still and made the earth tilt. It hadn't prepared her for being the center of a storm she created with her own assumptions. She looked around, hoping to find another officer, some backup, someone to de-escalate the energy. But she was alone. No radio static, no footsteps, just the sound of breath and judgment. She stepped back again. It wasn't surrender, it was retreat. And Shaq finally broke his gaze. He turned toward the path again, walking slowly back to where the trail looped toward the fountain. His stride was relaxed but carried an invisible weight. As he passed, a young man held up his phone and whispered, "Damn, that's how you do it." Shaq didn't respond. The moment wasn't about victory. It wasn't even about her anymore. It was about a system cracking on camera, revealing the rot behind the badge, and no amount of backpedaling would unspit that stain. Rains remained frozen in place for another moment before reaching for her radio, fingers trembling slightly now. "Dispatch," she said, voice rough around the edges. "We're code 4 at Liberty Grove. Subject is not a threat. Situation de-escalated." Her voice almost caught on that last word. She hated how it sounded like an admission. She hated even more how the dispatcher responded with a simple 10-4. There was no saving face. She turned without waiting for orders and walked briskly back to her cruiser. The air seemed heavier now. The crowd parted just enough for her to pass, but not without stares. Not without judgment. She could feel them burning hotter than the morning sun. The door slammed. She sat behind the wheel, breath ragged, the edges of her composure fraying. For a brief second, she considered turning the engine and driving far, far away. But her training wouldn't allow it. Instead, she pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the call icon for Chief Dale Carrington. She didn't press it. Because what would she say? "I spat at your best friend. I judged him before I saw him. I just became the story." No, she couldn't say any of that. Inside the park, Shaq disappeared around a bend. His figure, massive and steady, became smaller with distance, but not with presence. The people didn't forget. The cameras didn't forget. The silence he'd held had turned louder than any siren, any protest, any speech. And that silence now belonged to everyone watching. The freeze hadn't been about shock. It had been about recognition. Not of Shaquille O'Neal, the celebrity, but of Shaquille O'Neal, the man, demanding nothing, defending no one, and yet changing the balance of power with nothing but dignity. And in that space, where force could have escalated, and pride could have snapped, a different kind of justice had unfolded. One that didn't need a badge. One that didn't need a shout. One that only needed the stillness of a man who knew exactly who he was. Newark never hid its rough edges. Even in the late 70s, it carried a grit that clung to your skin, in the sidewalks, in the sirens, in the way people spoke with eyes more than mouths. It was a place where boys grew into armor before they grew into men. Shaquille, back then just Shawnee to his mother, wore that armor like a second skin before he ever knew why. The memory wasn't one he called upon often. It lived somewhere quiet, buried deep beneath years of arenas, trophies, endorsements, and applause. But every now and then, when a moment struck raw, like that morning in Liberty Grove, the memory rose like steam from old pavement. He had been 12, tall already, broad for his age, and growing faster than the neighborhood could keep up with. That particular afternoon, he'd been walking home from the corner store. A grape soda in one hand, bag of sunflower seeds in the other. He wasn't doing anything, he wasn't saying anything, but that never really mattered. The police cruiser rolled up beside him slow, a ghost made of steel and judgment. The window came down halfway, a white face stared back, eyes narrowed, mouth flat, no lights, no siren, just quiet hostility. "What you got there, son?" Shaq froze. The soda nearly slipped. He didn't know why he felt guilty. He hadn't done anything. But the question didn't feel like a question. It felt like a test he didn't study for. "Gonna answer me?" the cop snapped. The passenger door opened. Another officer stepped out, hand on his belt, not yet on his gun, but not far from it either. Shaq remembered the heat in his chest. Not fear, exactly. Confusion, maybe. The helplessness of being seen and not seen all at once. One of them approached, yanked the soda from his hand, popped the tab, and poured it out right there on the curb. "You don't match no description," he muttered, handing the empty can back like it meant something. "But next time, don't skulk, stand tall." They drove off, just like that. No apology, no name. Just two shadows fading in a city full of them. Shaq had walked home, without speaking. The sunflower seed stayed in his pocket, forgotten. His chest burned, not from tears, but from something heavier, something he didn't have a word for yet. Lucille was at the sink when he came in. She always seemed to know before he opened his mouth. Mothers did. She turned, saw his face, and put the dish towel down gently. He didn't cry, but she held his face with both hands and kissed his forehead. "They don't see you, baby. They see what they're afraid of." "I didn't do nothing," he muttered. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it worse." That night, his stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, a man forged in the military and disciplined like a cathedral bell, sat him down at the kitchen table. No raised voice, no fury, just steel and heart stitched into words. "You're gonna keep growing, son," he said. "Bigger, louder, even when you whisper. And that scares people who don't want to understand you." Shaq nodded, but didn't quite get it. "Every room you enter," Philip continued, "they'll see size before they see soul. That's their weakness. Not yours, but here's the rule. Don't let your anger become the story." Shaq looked up, unsure. "They'll want it to be. They'll try to bait it out of you. But power's not in the swing. It's in the stillness. Control your temperature. That's how you win." From that day on, Shaq carried the lesson like a compass. Through school, through the courts, through moments when the world begged for him to explode. He didn't always succeed. He was human after all. But those words, they etched themselves deeper than fame. Years later, when recruiters came knocking, when spotlights found him, when television turned him into a household name, none of it rewrote what had shaped him. The roar of a crowd never replaced the quiet truth of his kitchen table in Newark. The cheers, the wealth, the legacy, they were blessings. But they weren't absolution. Because fame, as he had learned, didn't bulletproof you from perception. It only made you easier to aim at. Even now, standing in public spaces as a man whose face adorned cereal boxes and sneakers, Shaq could still feel the echo of that officer's voice, spilling his soda like it was a declaration. And every time he walked through a city park, every time someone stared a beat too long, that 12-year-old boy walked with him, not afraid, just aware. And Lucille, his mother, his spine, she never let him forget the balance. She reminded him constantly that his heart was the loudest part of him. She taught him to speak with more than words, to make space for others without shrinking his own. She made him write thank you notes even when he didn't want to, told him kindness didn't need an audience. He remembered how, during his rookie year, she mailed him a clipping from the local paper. It wasn't about basketball. It was about a black teenager wrongfully arrested outside a library. Lucille had circled the headline in red and written one line underneath, "Always make space for the voiceless." Shaq had pinned it to his fridge. In recent years, when interviews asked why he gave so much, why he stayed grounded, why he walked instead of being chauffeured, he never told them this story. It wasn't theirs to consume. It belonged to the boy in Newark, the mother with a dish towel, the stepfather with iron in his voice. But that story breathed underneath every decision. Every time he held his tongue, every time he extended grace, every time someone looked at him and expected fire, and he offered silence instead. It was why in Liberty Grove Park, when spit hit gravel, Shaq didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of Kelly Raines. He wasn't surprised. He had seen her before, 100 times, in different uniforms, different faces, all wearing the same mask, and he knew better than to fight the mask. You revealed it by holding still long enough for it to slip. His power didn't come from fame. It came from knowing who he was before the world ever gave him a microphone. And as he walked past the crowd that morning, eyes watching, cameras raised, that boy from Newark was still walking with him. Not ashamed, not afraid, just ready. The video hit the internet like gasoline finding a spark. Within hours it was everywhere. Cropped, slowed down, meaned, dissected, filtered through the lenses of outrage, performance, and politics. Every angle had a narrative. Every narrative had a slant. But the moment at its center, the spit, the stillness, and Shaq's single sentence remained untouched. Raw. Inescapable. Shaq hadn't posted a word. No comment. No tweet. No late-night TV appearance to defend himself or drag anyone down. And yet the silence he held in Liberty Grove now echoed across every screen like a sermon. News anchors tried to shape it. Some called him stoic, others strategic. But Shaq wasn't playing strategy. He wasn't playing anything. He was tired of the performance. The networks came calling anyway. Every major one. They offered full-hour specials, donation tie-ins, panel shows. "Let's use this as a teaching moment," one producer had said, tone dipped in polished sincerity. Shaq declined them all. He didn't want his stillness repackaged as entertainment. He didn't want to debate what was plain. Meanwhile, Officer Raines had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. A phrase so stale it had lost all meaning. No charges, no apology, no public statement. Her union stayed silent. Her department issued a sterile two-line release, calling the incident under review and not indicative of department values. It was always the same. Always language wrapped in latex gloves. At the City Hall press conference, the mayor stood behind a podium with her rehearsed empathy and made sure to say words like accountability and growth. Shaq watched 15 seconds of it from his phone before locking the screen and slipping it back into his coat pocket. What gnawed at him wasn't Raines herself. It wasn't even the spit, or the footage, or the tidal wave of commentary. It was the pattern. The illusion of action. How systems mastered the art of appearing to change while staying rooted exactly where they'd always been. And he knew there was only one person he needed to confront about it. He made the call late that night. No assistant, no appointment, just Shaq in a direct line. "Dale," he said, "we need to talk." The next morning, inside the chief's office, the air was colder than usual, not from temperature but from the weight between them. Dale Carrington stood tall behind his desk, suit neat, badge clipped to his belt, eyes tired. He had always carried himself like a man walking a tightrope between duty and truth. But today there was no rope, just a chasm. They didn't shake hands. Shaq sat without asking, arms folded. Dale remained standing. "You know I respect you," Dale started, voice even. "You know I've fought to keep that badge from being a shield for hate." Shaq didn't blink. "Then explain why she's still wearing it." "She's not. She's suspended." "Leave isn't justice," Shaq cut in, his voice low but final. "It's a nap." Dale exhaled slowly, walked toward the window. The city sprawled beyond the glass, clean, neat, pretending. "I've got unions breathing down my neck. I've got city council watching every move. You think this is easy?" Dale asked, not angrily, but with something close to exhaustion. "I think it's always hard," Shaq said, "and that's the excuse." "You don't get it," Dale snapped, the first real heat entering his voice. "I'm the first black chief in this city's history. I can't afford to look reactionary. One wrong move, and they'll replace me with someone who doesn't care." Shaq leaned forward. "So we wait. Again. Like always." Dale didn't respond right away. He turned from the window and looked directly at his old friend. These weren't strangers. These were two men who'd broken bread, who'd stood shoulder to shoulder at community events, who'd lost people to the same battles. But now they stood on opposite sides of something deeper than policy. "You think I don't see it?" Dale said quietly. "You think I didn't watch that footage and want to throw her badge across the desk myself? Then why didn't you?" "Because the system doesn't move like that. It moves in steps." Shaq stood, towering, but his tone didn't rise. "And while it steps, we bleed." The words hit harder than raised voices ever could. Dale lowered his eyes for just a moment. "Every time something like this happens," Shaq continued, "we get promises, we get plans, we get press releases. But nothing changes, Dale. Not really. You can wear the title, but if you can't protect us from your own, what good is it?" Dale swallowed the lump rising in his throat. He wanted to argue. He wanted to defend himself, but the truth was louder than pride. There was a pause, one that didn't need filling. "You remember what your dad said to us when we were 15? Dale finally asked. Shaq nodded. "He said power isn't what you hold. It's what you choose to carry." "And what are you carrying right now, Shaq?" Shaq turned to the door. His hand rested on the handle, but he looked back once more. I'm carrying the weight of watching someone I believe in fold. And with that, he left. Outside the building, reporters were waiting, huddled behind metal barricades, mics ready, questions loaded. Shaq passed them in silence. His expression didn't change. The footage would loop for hours, but he wouldn't say a word. Inside, Dale sat down behind his desk and stared at his hands. They didn't feel like his anymore. They felt like tools the system borrowed whenever it needed optics. Shaq didn't look back. Not because he was done, but because the conversation wasn't over. It was just beginning. Shaq didn't speak about them. Not to his team. Not to Lucille. Not even to the board of the foundation. He'd always known that silence wasn't safety. It was exposure. But what twisted deeper now wasn't the words. It was how familiar they were. And they weren't just coming from strangers anymore. He felt it first in the shifts of tone at city events. A handshake that lingered too short. A glance held too long. Then came the whispers. The ones that followed him into rooms but never faced him. Shaq's gone soft, man. He ain't no hero. He's just another millionaire crying victim. You see how he let that cop play him? That's weakness, not grace. Most of them were quiet. Carefully positioned. The kind of talk that slides under doors and climbs into people's ears while they're still deciding who to believe. But it was working. Slowly, methodically, it was working. By the time the third week hit, Shaq was no longer just the man who stood still in the face of injustice. He was the subject of think pieces dissecting whether he was leveraging racial trauma for cultural relevance. News panels debated whether his silence was calculated, strategic, or passive-aggressive activism. Every breath he didn't take publicly was being turned into a headline. And in the midst of it all, Officer Kelly Raines broke her silence. Her attorney, clean-shaven, young, media-polished, went straight to the networks, in a nationally televised sit-down. He painted a new picture, not of spit, not of silence, but of fear. She felt threatened, the lawyer said, eyes steady and voice smooth. Officer Raines responded to a call about a large male suspect matching the description of someone who'd been intimidating passers-by. She feared for her safety. And when she realized who he was, the pressure only magnified. She never meant to escalate. She meant to survive. The word survive rolled off his tongue like a verdict. And just like that, the narrative was repackaged. Raines was no longer the aggressor. She was a scared officer, overwhelmed by a public icon towering over her in a park full of civilians. Her body cam malfunctioned, but they had her radio logs, and conveniently they had witnesses. Anonymous ones willing to say they saw Shaq approach quickly, that his size was intimidating, that the scene felt tense. Shaq watched the clip from his living room. Lights off, phone upside down. They were painting him as the storm in someone else's sky. The whispers turned sharper after that. The union issued a statement subtly condemning celebrity interference in lawful policing procedures. Talk radio hosts ran with it. One host, infamous for playing devil's advocate under the guise of free speech, played a soundbite of Shaq's quiet line, "Call your boss." He looped it, mocked the tone, framed it as veiled threat. "Sounds like intimidation to me," the host chuckled. "I thought heroes didn't flex connections." Social media split in half. One side rallied, calling out the narrative flip, posting side-by-side comparisons of Shaq's history of charity, mentorship, and public service. The other side dug into every mistake he'd ever made, every technical foul, every cocky quote from his rookie years. They shared grainy screenshots of him making a face in a game, weaponized out of context. They didn't want truth. They wanted a version of him they could control. Even in spaces he thought were safe, the air turned tight. At a charity gala, a city official shook his hand and muttered, "Hope you're handling the heat." A board member from one of his programs politely suggested, "Maybe we keep things quiet until this blows over." Quiet. Again. Shaq met with Lucille that Sunday. Her house hadn't changed in decades. Same cross over the doorframe, same humming from the kitchen, same worn couch cushions with faded embroidery. He sat on the edge of the seat, like he used to when he'd done something wrong. "I thought staying calm would protect something," he said. Lucille poured him tea, and didn't speak until she'd placed the cup in his hands. "It did," she finally said. "It protected you. It protected that old man. It protected that park. But it won't protect their comfort. What if they twist it all the way around? They already have. But truth don't bend. It waits." And still, the pressure mounted. Anonymous callers reached out to sponsors. One brand paused a campaign. Another didn't return his agent's email. The whispers were becoming policy. And Rains? Her attorney filed for defamation. Claimed her career was irreparably harmed by an intentional smear campaign. She held a press conference, tears glistening but perfectly framed. I've been called racist. I've been threatened. All for doing my job. No one asked her why she spat. No one asked her why she approached without protocol. No one asked her why her body cam glitched. And yet she was becoming a martyr in some circles, a face of the anti-police movement, a symbol of resistance to cancel culture. Shaq's team urged him to speak, to reclaim the story, to film a response video, to hold a rally, but he said no, because the war being fought wasn't about the moment anymore. It was about the narrative ecosystem, about how fast a system could swallow a truth and spit back a version of it unrecognizable. But Shaq had one thing they didn't: time. Not in the lazy, waited-out kind of way, but in the earned-it kind of way. He had history, he had roots, he had receipts, and he had people who weren't afraid to speak even when he chose not to. Because while the whispers multiplied behind closed doors, something else had started quietly elsewhere. A letter, written by the old man from the park, was published in a local newspaper. I watched a man carry dignity like it weighed nothing. The letter read. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his fists. But he raised the bar for what restraint looks like. That letter went viral in its own quiet way. Shared not for clicks, but for meaning. And in the shadows where perception tried to rot the truth, that letter became the seed of something else, something stronger than spin. Because silence, in the hands of a man like Shaq, wasn't surrender. It was the sound of waiting for the noise to wear itself out. His name was Wendell Burke, and nobody knew it at first. Not the kids in the park, not the officers reviewing footage, not even the news anchors cycling the viral video of a towering man helping a stranger, only to be spat at by authority. Wendell had always preferred to stay behind the byline. 40 years in journalism had taught him how to observe without interfering, how to record history without shaping it. But something shifted in him that day, when Shaq reached for his grocery cart. Wendell hadn't asked for help. That mattered. He'd spent decades telling stories about black men being misjudged, misnamed, mishandled, often from behind a desk while younger journalists gathered quotes. But in that moment, standing on tired legs with a half-broken cart, he was the one receiving a gesture that carried more weight than his notebook ever had. And then, moments later, he became the silent witness to what would become the most watched act of public humiliation that month. Wendell didn't say anything at first. He sat on the bench and watched Shaq walk away. Watched Officer Rains stumble beneath the gravity of what she'd done. Watched a park full of people wrestle with how deeply their silence spoke. Then he went home and did what he knew how to do best. He wrote. The op-ed hit the internet 2 days later, in the Courier, an online independent outlet that Wendell had written for off and on since retiring. The title was sharp but measured: The Giant Who Didn't Strike Back. It wasn't a long piece, just under 700 words. But every line struck something deep in the collective conscience. I watched a giant stoop down in kindness, he wrote, and I watched a system spit in his face. I saw a man who could have crushed someone with a glance, choose instead to carry dignity like it was a child in his arms. And I watched a crowd of people, myself included, do the one thing history taught us never to do. We hesitated. It caught fire in the way truth often does when dressed in honesty. Instead of outrage, it was shared by professors, pastors, high school teachers, retired cops. No hashtags, no filters, just words carrying more truth than 10 press releases, stitched together. Shaq didn't even know about the article until his foundation's program director printed it out and left it on his desk with nothing but a sticky note attached. You need to read this. He did, twice. Wendell's name rang a bell. After a few phone calls, it all clicked. Wendell had once covered one of Shaq's earliest high school games, back when he was still learning how to control his feet, long before the world expected him to carry its weight. But this article wasn't about stats or legacy. It was about witness. And in a climate thick with spin, testimony had become a rare and sacred currency. By the end of the week, Shaq's inbox flooded with invitations. Not interviews, not podcasts, but conversations. Middle schools, colleges, community centers. Teachers wanted him to speak not as a star but as a man who embodied restraint when it was hardest. He declined most of them at first. He wasn't trying to be a symbol, but something in Wendell's piece had reminded him that silence isn't always noble when it becomes complicity. So he picked one. A high school in the same district where Liberty Grove sat, just blocks from where Raines had once trained as a rookie. The auditorium was packed. No media, no security detail, just students, teachers, and Shaq at the front of the stage, in a folding chair speaking with the same measured tone he used in the park. He didn't talk about fame. He talked about anger, about how it tastes bitter when you swallow it too long, about how sometimes your silence isn't silence, it's survival, and how sometimes survival demands more strength than retaliation ever will. The room was quiet, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that meant people were listening, not to respond, but to feel. Word spread quickly. Other schools followed. Community organizers began assembling teach-ins around the incident. Posters appeared around Liberty Grove, with Shaq's silhouette and Wendell's quote, "The giant who didn't strike back." It wasn't hero worship, it was something different, reverence, maybe, or responsibility. But not everyone was celebrating. The police union fired back within days. In a fiery press release, they called the growing support for Shaq a coordinated smear campaign against a dedicated officer under immense pressure. They accused the public of overcorrecting and the department of caving to celebrity pressure. They didn't name Shaq directly, but they didn't have to. Anonymous sources leaked that internal emails were circulating within the department, urging officers to stay firm against political agendas. Some even suggested a boycott of Shaq's businesses and partnerships. Others went further, questioning the legitimacy of Wendell's op-ed. One fringe outlet accused him of fabricating the events for a book deal. Wendell, in his soft but certain way, addressed the backlash in a second article. "The truth doesn't require permission," he wrote, "and it certainly doesn't retreat under the weight of backlash. If bearing witness makes me inconvenient, I accept that role." Shaq read that one too, and this time, he made a call. They met at a quiet cafe, on the west side of town. No photographers, no PR team, just two men who had seen too much, and still believed in something quieter than spectacle. "I didn't ask for this," Shaq told him, stirring his coffee. Wendell nodded. "None of us do. But sometimes you're the one standing still when history's running loose." "You think it changes anything?" Shaq asked. "The article, the speeches, the signs?" "It already has," Wendell said. "Not everything, but something, enough to matter." As they sat there, outside the cafe window, a group of college students passed holding signs. "Dignity is resistance. Witness matters. Speak even when you're tired." Shaq didn't wave. He didn't stand. He just watched. And for the first time since the park, he didn't feel like he was walking through someone else's storm. He was part of the rebuild. And Wendell, just an old man with a pen, had cracked open the silence wide enough for others to breathe. Shaq came alone, as always, dressed in gray again, moving with that deliberate slowness that had become his signature. A symbol of peace, some had called it. A monument to patience, others claimed. But today, even he could feel the weight of something unresolved catching at his heels. He passed the statue of Martha Caldwell, and paused longer than usual. The plaque hadn't changed, but the meaning behind it had deepened, since that day weeks ago. The day a uniform had spat at him, and silence had bared its teeth. His eyes lingered on her bronze eyes, as if searching for some confirmation that restraint hadn't been cowardice. That's when he heard the voice behind him. "You had the chance to burn it all down, and you didn't. Why?" The voice didn't carry accusation at first. Just raw curiosity wrapped in something jagged. Shaq turned slowly, and found a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, wiry frame, loose hoodie, and a stare that didn't flinch. His name tag from a fast food job still hung off his lanyard. There was grease on his sleeves, and rebellion in his tone. Shaq didn't answer immediately. He just studied the boy's posture. The way he stood, like someone ready to argue, not because he enjoyed conflict, but because life had trained him to expect it. "Why didn't you?" the teen repeated, louder now. "You had it, man. All of it. The footage, the press, the people. You could have taken her down, taken the whole thing down. But you just walked away." Shaq exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that had held too many replies over the years. "I didn't walk away," he said quietly. "I chose another way." The teen scoffed. "Yeah, the safe way." Shaq tilted his head, not in offense, but in recognition. He remembered being that age. Remembered how fury came easier than focus, how the fire inside didn't know where to burn, so it scorched everything nearby. The boy stepped closer. She spat in your face, man. Or close enough. That's war. But you just let her. I didn't let her, Shaq said, voice firmer now. I let her reveal herself. That stopped the boy for half a second, but not long enough. What did that do, huh? She's still out. She's still protected. Your chief friend did nothing. You're still walking, and she's still smiling somewhere. Shaq lowered his gaze. Not out of shame, but because the truth had to be spoken carefully, when it was carved from pain. You think justice is fire, he said, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's quiet, and sometimes it starts with letting the whole world see who the enemy really is. The teen blinked. The anger softened, but didn't leave. But sometimes people don't care what they see. They just move on. Shaq didn't argue, because that too was true. As the boy walked away, Shaq turned back toward the trail, but the moment lingered. A mirror had been held up to him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he liked what was looking back. In trying to stay above the fight, had he allowed the rot to root deeper? Was restraint the same as enabling when the system never planned to change? That question followed him as he continued through the park, cutting toward the corner where a small crowd had gathered near the bulletin board. Flyers flapped in the breeze, some promoting local concerts, others protesting police overreach. But one stood out, a printed article, a report with a headline in bold red font. Councilman Jared Finley, under fire. Family ties to Liberty Grove officer spark conflict of interest debate. Shaq moved closer. His eyes scanned the lines. He didn't flinch, didn't react outwardly, but the words rearranged something in his chest. Multiple sources confirm that Officer Kelly Raines, recently placed on administrative leave following an incident involving public figure Shaquille O'Neal, is the niece of City Councilman Gerard Finley, currently running for re-election in the city's 8th district. Insiders suggest Raines's presence at Liberty Grove Park that morning may not have been routine, but part of a targeted provocation strategy. Provocation. The word clanged in his brain. He kept reading. Finley has long been associated with a faction of the council resistant to police reform. His voting record reflects opposition to increased body cam mandates and community oversight boards. In closed meetings, he's voiced concern about celebrity interference in law enforcement narratives. It hadn't been random. Not a rogue officer. Not a moment of poor judgment. It had been a setup. Shaq stepped back from the board and felt the gravity of it all settle. Her badge wasn't the only shield. Her last name was, her arrogance, her certainty, her refusal to show fear. It all made sense now. She wasn't just acting on impulse. She had permission, encouragement, maybe even instructions. They'd wanted him to react, wanted him to lose control. Because if he had, they could have framed it, pushed it through the pipeline, labeled him aggressive, unstable, dangerous, and he hadn't given it to them. He denied them the moment. But in doing so, had he let them walk away clean? Shaq felt the pull now, not toward vengeance, but toward clarity. He had to make a choice, not whether to fight. That was already decided. But how to fight? With truth, yes, with voice, but maybe no longer with distance. The narrative had already started to bend. Wendell's words had lit the match. The student protests were building. People were asking deeper questions. But this twist, this truth about the trap, it changed everything. Because now it wasn't about a cop and a man in a park. It was about corruption dressed in suits. About elections powered by manipulation. About weaponizing perception to preserve power. Shaq knew this was his next move. Not to retaliate, but to expose. Let the mirror crack wide open. Let the people see what happens when the system plays chess with human dignity and loses it. It was just after 9:30 p.m. when the knock came. Not loud, but certain. Like the person on the other side already knew he didn't have the right to demand entry. Shaq was in his home office, sitting in silence, the room lit only by the desk lamp that cast long shadows over stacks of letters, clippings, and unopened envelopes. He knew the rhythm of that knock before he even rose to answer it. Dale Carrington stood at the door, out of uniform, his badge not visible, sleeves rolled up as if he'd been trying to scrub something off his conscience, and failed. The street behind him was quiet. No patrol car. No driver waiting. He'd come alone. Shaq didn't say anything. He just stepped aside and let him in. They hadn't spoken face to face since that morning in Dale's office. The morning Shaq had walked out carrying disappointment like a loaded weight in his chest. Now the air between them was tighter, denser. Not cold, not hot, just heavy. Dale moved slowly, settling on the edge of the leather armchair like it might reject him. Shaq stayed standing. He didn't need to tower. He already did. For a long minute neither spoke. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock, and the faint buzz of streetlights beyond the window.
Then Dale cleared his throat.
Not to speak, but to keep himself from choking on what needed to come out. "I knew," he said finally. "I knew what she was doing." The words didn't drop like a bomb. They landed soft, too soft. That was what made them worse. Shaq didn't flinch. His arms remained crossed, his face unreadable, but something behind his eyes darkened just a shade. Dale leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers intertwined. "I got the call 2 days before the incident. Finley's people were pushing for a stronger presence in Liberty Grove. Said there were rumors about high-profile figures creating unrest. Said we should send someone visible. Someone firm. Someone firm." "You sent a rookie with a record," Shaq said flatly. "Someone itching to make a name." Dale nodded slowly. "I didn't assign her directly, but I didn't stop it. I let the pieces fall where they wanted to. I convinced myself it wasn't what it looked like." Shaq stepped closer, still quiet. Dale's voice cracked now, brittle as the confession cut deeper. "And when the video came out, when it went viral, I knew the second I saw your face that I had failed. Not just as chief, but as your friend." The word friend hung in the air like a splinter. Shaq finally spoke, his voice measured, almost gentle. "You weren't scared of her. You were scared of them." Dale looked down, ashamed. "I was scared of losing everything I fought to build. My position, my influence. I thought if I played it smart, let the politics pass, I could fix things from the inside later." "And how many people have to pay the price while you wait for later?" Shaq asked. He wasn't yelling. He didn't have to. His words landed with precision, with a weight that no volume could match. Dale blinked hard, his eyes wet now. "I kept telling myself that holding the seat was more important than any single mistake." Shaq's tone didn't waver, but it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Dale finally looked up. His face, lined with stress and regret, was the face of a man unraveling in real time. "I came tonight to tell you I'm stepping down." Shaq didn't react.
"I already wrote the statement. Gonna submit it to the mayor in the morning. Let someone else, someone not compromised, take the seat."
Silence stretched again. Not awkward, loaded. Shaq moved then. He walked to the window, looked out at the neighborhood, the flicker of porch lights, the distant bark of a dog, the ordinary hum of a city that had no idea what was being unraveled, in a quiet living room just blocks from where it all began. Then he turned back to Dale. "No," he said. Dale blinked. "No? You don't get to quit." "I don't want your resignation," Shaq said firmly. "I want your accountability." Dale's confusion lingered for a beat. "You step down now. They'll just slide in someone Finley handpicks. Someone who won't hesitate. Someone who doesn't even pretend to care. So what do you want me to do?" Shaq stepped closer. "Fix it." Dale swallowed hard. I mean clean house. Tell the truth. About Finley. About Rains. About what you knew. You don't get to walk away before doing that." Dale looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. "That could burn everything down." Shaq nodded once. "Maybe it should." They stood there, eye to eye, two men who had once walked the same path, now standing on opposite ends of consequence. And still Shaq didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. Tired of secrets. Tired of performances. Tired of seeing people he believed in buckle under the weight of proximity to power. Dale rose to his feet, his voice steadier now. "I'll do it. Not for politics. Not for press. But because you're right." Shaq didn't respond. Didn't shake his hand. But he nodded. That was enough. As Dale walked to the door, he paused with his hand on the knob. "You ever regret not blowing it all up?" he asked. Shaq thought for a moment, then answered, quiet but certain. "Every day. And then I remember who gets buried in the rubble." The door opened, and then it closed, leaving the house still again. But something had shifted. A confession had been made. An accountability, real, raw, rare, had finally found its footing. The morning of the march rose quietly, without the usual static that came before protest. There were no bullhorns, no flyers scattered across sidewalks, no rhythmic chants leaking into the streets. This movement didn't announce itself. It arrived like breath held too long, finally exhaled. The community had chosen the date with care. 1 month to the day since the incident in Liberty Grove. Enough time for the world to speak, spin, forget, and scroll past, but not enough time for those who lived it to heal or ignore. The call had gone out through word of mouth, posted in barbershops, churches, inboxes, and group chats. No logos, no sponsors, just 4 words: walk, don't shout, show up. By 9 a.m., the entrance of Liberty Grove Park had become a quiet convergence point. They came from every corner of the city: nurses in scrubs, teachers in polos, elders with walking sticks, college kids with cameras slung across their shoulders, young fathers holding their children's hands. Some wore black, some wore gray, some wore old Shaq jerseys turned inside out, not out of shame, but as a way to mute celebrity and elevate cause. Shaq stood near the front, dressed in the same gray hoodie he'd worn that day. No logos, no laces tight, just him, raw and grounded. By his side stood Lucille, upright and unshaken, her hand looped through his arm like it had been since he was a boy. Her other hand held a small cardboard sign, handwritten in black ink: "Respect has no size." The crowd parted to give him room, not out of reverence, but because they understood this moment wasn't about visibility. It was about witness, and there was no one better suited to lead than the man who'd never needed a mic to make his presence felt. They began the march slowly. No music, no speeches, just the rhythm of feet, brushing gravel. It wasn't somber, it wasn't angry, it was something deeper, full. Every step forward echoed the weight of what had come before. The spit, the silence, the whispers, the betrayal, and now, this step's chosen, not forced. Movement, not toward vengeance, but toward clarity. The route wound through the familiar parts of the park, past the bench where Shaq had helped Wendell with his cart, past the fountain that still carried coins from kids' wishes, past the statue of Martha Caldwell, whose bronze eyes had watched history repeat itself too many times, and high above, posted along the march's path, volunteers held long wooden signs. Not flashy, not digital, just steady, still standing. Grace is resistance, we remember in silence, and the one that drew the most eyes. The system spit. We did not. There were no speeches scheduled, none needed. The march was the message. But from the second-floor window of a parked black sedan, partially hidden behind tinted glass near the park's north end, someone else was watching. Officer Kelly Raines, no longer in uniform, no longer shielded by rank or silence, sat still, hands gripping the steering wheel. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her eyes fixed on the moving line of people below, so many of whom she didn't know, yet all of whom knew exactly who she was. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. But her knuckles were white, her breath uneven. No cameras turned toward her now. She was just another person in the background of a story she had once tried to control. And now the story was walking without her. Her career wasn't ended by policy. It was ended by truth. Not shouted down, just revealed, one quiet footstep at a time. And at the center of it all, Shaq kept walking. He didn't wave, didn't pose, didn't nod for the cameras that tried to capture the weight of the moment. He was not the message. He was part of it, one beat in a larger rhythm. Children along the path reached out to touch his hand. Elders nodded from wheelchairs. A pastor at the rear of the crowd whispered scripture as he walked. And Lucille, steady as ever, walked with a purpose only mothers understand. Not just for her son, but for every mother whose child had been misread by the world. At the final turn, near the old sycamore tree where the trail curved toward the statue, the crowd slowed. Shaq stepped forward, raised his hand, not to command, just to signal. And then everyone stopped. 1 minute of stillness. No countdown, no cue. Just the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled. And in that silence, something happened. Phones went down. Eyes lifted. Hands reached across shoulders. A girl closed her eyes. A father clutched his child tighter. The air stilled like it understood this was the moment it had been waiting for. There was no applause, no sound cue, no announcement. Just breath. And after that breath, they began to move again back through the park, through neighborhoods, through lives that would never see things the same way again. Later that evening, the footage would circulate. Not viral like the first video, but quietly, meaningfully. It would be played in classrooms, at town halls. It would be studied not for the noise but for the stillness, for the lesson that power isn't always volume, that real strength never shouts. And for Shaq, it was never about being right. It was about being real. The story didn't end with a charge filed or a badge stripped. It ended with people walking. Not because they had to, but because when truth finally shows up, you walk beside it. You walk behind it. And if you're brave enough, you lead. If this story stayed with you, carry it forward. Not in hashtags, but in how you see, listen, and show up. Let silence mean strength, not surrender. Let justice be personal, not performative. And when the moment comes to